The night was black as pitch over London on September 4th, 1940. Searchlight beams stabbed frantically through the darkness, momentarily illuminating the underside of low clouds before continuing their desperate sweep across the heavens. The rhythmic drone of Luftwaffe bombers filled the air, a sound that had become all too familiar to Londoners huddled in shelters below. But on this night, something remarkable was about to happen, something that would change the course of the air war. In the cramped cockpit of his Bristol Beaufighter, Flight Lieutenant Merrill Thornton gripped the control column with sweaty palms, his eyes straining against the darkness. The revolutionary airborne radar set mounted in the nose of his aircraft was emitting faint pulses, searching for the enemy. Beside him, radar operator Sergeant Harold Wellesley monitored the primitive cathode ray tube, where ghostly blips signaled the presence of German aircraft. They were hunting in a deadly game where the stakes couldn't be higher. 21 Luftwaffe spotters, specialized aircraft tasked with illuminating targets for the bomber streams, were somewhere in the night sky above the capital. "Contact, sir," Wellesley's voice crackled through the intercom. 11 o'clock, 4 miles, moving slow. Signature matches a Dornier. Thornton's heart raced as he banked the aircraft gently toward the contact. What no one in the 21st Squadron knew was that one man's unauthorized modification to standard equipment would soon rewrite the rules of night fighting forever. The date was significant. It marked exactly 1 year since Britain had declared war on Nazi Germany. In the intervening months, the Luftwaffe had pounded British cities night after night, with seemingly unstoppable precision. No one in the Royal Air Force command structure yet realized that Thornton's desperate improvisation that night would change the course of the aerial battle for Britain's survival. Merrill Thornton had not been born into privilege or wealth. The son of a Lancashire textile worker, he had grown up amid the clatter of looms and the acrid smell of dye works. His childhood home in Blackburn consisted of a small terraced house where his family of 6 shared 3 tiny rooms. Despite these humble beginnings, young Merrill displayed remarkable aptitude for all things mechanical. By the age of 12, he had disassembled and rebuilt his father's prized radio set, improving its reception to the astonishment of neighbors who began bringing their own wireless sets for the boy to repair. In school, his mathematics teacher recognized a rare talent, arranging for him to receive a scholarship to study electrical engineering at Manchester Technical College. It was there in 1934 that Thornton first encountered the emerging science of radio direction finding. While most students focused on conventional applications, Thornton became fascinated with the theoretical possibilities of electromagnetic waves. His graduate thesis on signal propagation caught the attention of several industrial firms, but with war clouds gathering over Europe, he made the decision to volunteer for the Royal Air Force before conscription became inevitable. His technical background earned him a commission and placement in signals intelligence, where he excelled during training. By 1939, Flight Lieutenant Thornton was assigned to a radar development unit, working alongside scientists from the Telecommunications Research Establishment to improve Britain's fledgling radar network. When the war began, Thornton had requested a transfer to an operational squadron. His superiors, reluctant to lose his technical expertise, initially refused. It took months of persistent requests before he was finally assigned to flight training, where he demonstrated natural piloting ability. By July 1940, he had joined the newly formed 21st Squadron, one of the first units equipped with radar-carrying night fighters. The squadron commander, Wing Commander Geoffrey Haviland, recognized something special in the engineer-turned-pilot. "Thornton sees problems differently," he wrote in an evaluation. "Where others see limitations, he sees possibilities. This quality may prove invaluable in our current predicament." Those words would prove prophetic as Britain entered its darkest hour. What no one could have predicted was how Thornton's unconventional thinking would soon alter the balance of night warfare in British skies. The first weeks with the squadron were frustrating for Thornton. The early AI Mark IV airborne radar sets were temperamental, limited in range and difficult to interpret. Night after night, RAF night fighters launched to intercept German bombers, only to find themselves groping blindly through the darkness while London burned below. One evening in late August, after another unsuccessful sortie, Thornton remained in the cockpit long after the other pilots had gone to debrief. He methodically tested various settings on the radar set, making detailed notes in a small leather-bound journal. When questioned by a curious ground crewman, he simply replied, "Just trying to understand how Jerry keeps slipping past us." His obsession with the technical limitations of the equipment became a running joke within the squadron. "There goes Thornton, off to commune with his magical black box again," pilots would quip as he headed to the maintenance hangar during off-duty hours. What they didn't realize was that Thornton was developing a theory, one that would soon prove revolutionary. By the summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain had entered a critical phase. The German Luftwaffe had shifted from targeting RAF airfields to bombing London directly, hoping to break British morale and force capitulation. The scale of the aerial onslaught was unprecedented in warfare. Nearly 1,000 German aircraft would cross the English Channel each night, dropping hundreds of tons of explosives on British cities. The human cost was staggering. Civilian casualties mounted daily as buildings were reduced to rubble, and entire neighborhoods vanished in firestorms. Conventional military wisdom held that the bomber will always get through. Without the ability to detect and intercept enemy aircraft in darkness, cities lay vulnerable to devastating night raids. This vulnerability was exacerbated by the Luftwaffe's sophisticated navigation aids, radio beams codenamed Nickerbein and X-Juret, that allowed German bombers to find targets with remarkable precision even in complete darkness or overcast conditions. The British had begun to develop countermeasures against these systems in what became known as the Battle of the Beams, but the German tactics evolved quickly. By September 1940, they had introduced specially equipped Pathfinder aircraft, spotters, that would arrive ahead of the main bomber force to mark targets with incendiary flares. These aircraft, typically modified Dornier Do-17 bombers or Junkers Ju-88 models, carried additional crew members to operate sophisticated radio equipment and drop magnesium flares. The bright cascading lights would illuminate target areas for the following bomber streams, creating what Londoners called Christmas tree patterns in the night sky before the bombs began to fall. The presence of these spotters was particularly troubling to RAF Fighter Command. If they could be intercepted before they marked targets, the subsequent bomber force would be rendered far less effective. But finding these aircraft in the vastness of the night sky remained an almost impossible challenge. Adding to the difficulty, the Germans had recently begun flying their spotters in loose formations, typically groups of 3 to 7 aircraft, providing mutual protection and ensuring that at least some would reach their targets. Intelligence reports indicated that on the night of September 4th, an unusually large formation of 21 spotters would lead a major raid on London's East End docks, where vital supplies were being unloaded for the war effort. At Tangmere Airfield in Sussex, the 21st Squadron had been placed on high alert. Radar stations along the coast had detected large formations assembling over northern France. Meteorological reports predicted clear skies with a 3/4 moon, ideal conditions for a major raid. As pilots gathered in the briefing room, Squadron Leader Haviland outlined the gravity of the situation. "Gentlemen, tonight's effort may determine whether London's port facilities remain operational. If these spotters succeed in marking the docks accurately, the damage could be catastrophic." What no one in the room knew was that Thornton had spent the previous 3 nights implementing an unauthorized modification to his aircraft's radar system, a modification that he believed might just tip the scales in this high-stakes game of technological warfare. The Bristol Beaufighter was a fearsome aircraft, a dedicated night fighter with 4 20mm cannons concentrated in the nose and 6 machine guns in the wings. With 2 powerful Bristol Hercules engines, it could reach speeds of over 300 miles per hour, making it faster than most German bombers. But its greatest advantage was the AI Mark IV radar, which allowed it to detect enemy aircraft in darkness. The system worked by sending out radio pulses and measuring the reflections bounced back from metal objects like aircraft. However, its effectiveness was limited by range, accuracy, and the skill of the operators interpreting the primitive display. What Thornton had realized through his experimentation was something remarkable. The radar not only received reflections, but could also be modified to broadcast a continuous signal on frequencies that German aircraft used for their own navigation. His theory was both simple and revolutionary. If he could transmit false signals that mimicked those used by German pathfinders to communicate with each other, he might be able to disrupt their carefully planned formations. With the help of Sergeant Wellesley, who shared his passion for radio technology, and a sympathetic ground crew chief who looked the other way, Thornton had installed a small additional transmitter, salvaged from a damaged bomber. The device was crude but functional, capable of broadcasting on the same frequencies used by Luftwaffe aircraft for short-range communication. They had nicknamed this unauthorized modification the Ghost Beam. If it worked, it would allow them to broadcast deceptive signals that might confuse German pilots about their position relative to other aircraft in their formation. "This is highly irregular, Flight Lieutenant," Wellesley had said when Thornton first proposed the modification. "If Command gets wind of this, then we'll be court-martialed with London burning in the background," Thornton had replied grimly. "But if it works, they might just pin medals on us instead." Now, as they climbed through the night sky to intercept the incoming raiders, that moment of reckoning was at hand. They had tested the system on several previous nights with inconclusive results. Tonight would be its true trial by fire. At 2200 hours, the first German aircraft crossed the English coast. Chain-home radar stations tracked multiple formations heading toward London from the southeast, their courses aligning perfectly with the prediction that the East End docks were the primary target. Ground controllers vectored RAF night fighters toward the incoming raids, but interceptions remained difficult despite the relatively clear night. The German pilots flew in disciplined formations, maintaining strict radio silence and navigating by compass, stopwatch, and visual reference to key landmarks when possible. What made the Luftwaffe spotters particularly effective was their use of high-frequency radio tones to maintain formation in darkness. These signals were barely perceptible to human ears, but allowed aircraft to position themselves relative to a lead aircraft. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Different tone patterns indicated different positions in the formation. As Thornton's Beaufighter climbed to 20,000 feet over the outskirts of London, Wellesley detected the first signals from the approaching spotter formation. "They're using the standard frequency tonight, sir," he reported. "Signal strength indicates they're approximately 5 miles ahead, bearing 035. Thornton nodded, feeling a surge of anticipation. "Perfect. Let's get above them before they reach the city centre." He pushed the throttles forward, the Beaufighter's engines roaring as they climbed higher, positioning themselves above the projected path of the German formation. "Time to wake our ghost, Sergeant," Thornton said as they reached their intercept position. Wellesley flipped a switch on the jury-rigged apparatus mounted beside the radar set. A small green light indicated it was now transmitting. The Ghost Beam was active, broadcasting carefully modulated signals designed to mimic those used by the lead German aircraft, but with subtle variations in the tone patterns. The concept was audacious. If successful, German pilots would receive contradictory positioning signals, each believing their formation was diverging from the planned route. The confusion might disrupt their carefully choreographed target-marking mission. For several tense minutes, nothing happened. The blips on Thornton's radar continued their steady progress toward London. Had the gambit failed? Then, subtly at first, the pattern on the radar screen began to change. Instead of maintaining their tight formation, the German aircraft began to separate, each responding to what they believed were correction signals from their leader. "It's working," Wellesley whispered, his voice tight with excitement. "Look at them scatter." Thornton watched in amazement as the previously organized formation began to disintegrate. Some aircraft turned east, others west, while a few continued on the original course but at different altitudes. The carefully planned spotter operation was devolving into chaos. But the work wasn't finished. Thornton knew that disrupting the formation wasn't enough. They needed to prevent any of the spotters from reaching their targets. "Time for Phase 2, he said, adjusting the Ghost Beam's frequency slightly. Now, instead of simply disrupting formation, they began broadcasting what appeared to be emergency recall signals. the coded transmissions that would order German aircraft to abort their mission and return to base. Below them, searchlights from London's air defences swept the sky, occasionally illuminating the underside of a German aircraft as it wandered off course. Anti-aircraft guns began firing, their shells bursting in black puffs against the night sky, adding to the confusion. What happened next exceeded even Thornton's most optimistic expectations. The 21 Luftwaffe spotters, now thoroughly disoriented and receiving what they believed were authentic recall commands, began turning back toward France. Some flew dangerously close to each other in the darkness, forcing abrupt maneuvers to avoid collisions. "They're withdrawing," Wellesley reported incredulously, watching the radar screen. All of them. Not a single flare was dropped over London that night. Without the target markers, the main bomber force that arrived 30 minutes later found themselves flying over a darkened city with no clear indication of their targets. Most jettisoned their bombs over open countryside or the Thames estuary before returning to their bases in France, their mission a costly failure. As dawn broke over Britain on September 5, 1940, air raid wardens and fire crews stood down, bewildered by the unexpectedly quiet night. Reports filtered in from across southeastern England, dozens of unexploded bombs in fields, a few minor fires in outlying areas, but the expected devastation of London's vital docklands had not materialized. At Tangmere, Thornton and Wellesley landed their Beaufighter just as the eastern sky began to lighten. They taxied to their hardstand in silence, both men still processing what they had witnessed. As the engines spun down, the ground crew approached, eager for news of the night's operations. "Did you get any, sir?" the chief mechanic asked, referring to enemy aircraft shot down. Thornton exchanged a glance with Wellesley before responding. "None directly," he said, "but I think we may have found something better than a few victories." Word of the aborted raid quickly reached RAF Fighter Command. Initial reports credited the failure to poor German navigation or possible mechanical issues with their aircraft. No one connected it to the actions of a single Beaufighter crew with an unauthorized radio transmitter. For 2 more nights, Thornton and Wellesley employed their ghost beam with similar success, each time disrupting German spotter formations before they could mark targets. By the 3rd night, the Germans had begun to suspect some form of electronic interference and changed their communication frequencies. But by then, Thornton had collected enough data to prove his concept worked. With Wellesley's help, he drafted a detailed report and requested an urgent meeting with the squadron's intelligence officer, Flight Lieutenant Everett Spencer. Spencer, a former Oxford physics lecturer, immediately recognized the significance of what Thornton had achieved. "You realize what you've done, don't you?" he asked after reviewing the report. "You've created an entirely new form of aerial warfare." Within 48 hours, Thornton found himself summoned to a classified briefing at Fighter Command headquarters. There, in a room filled with senior officers and scientists from the telecommunications research establishment, he explained his ghost beam concept, detailing the technical specifications and operational results. The reception was mixed. Some officers were outraged at the unauthorized modification of equipment. Others saw the strategic potential immediately. The debate might have continued indefinitely had Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commander of No. 11 Group RAF, not intervened. "Gentlemen," Park said, silencing the room, "while we debate protocols, London burns. Flight Lieutenant Thornton has demonstrated an effective countermeasure that could save thousands of lives. I suggest we focus on implementing it rather than critiquing his methods." Within a week, a formal program was established to develop what was now officially designated the Phantom Signal Disruptor. Thornton was assigned to lead a small team of radar technicians and radio engineers, working directly with the telecommunications research establishment to refine and standardize the system for broader deployment. By October 1940, 6 Beaufighters had been equipped with the improved version of Thornton's device. Operating from airfields around London, these aircraft formed a specialized unit tasked with electronic disruption of enemy formations. Their success was immediate and dramatic. German bombing accuracy over British cities declined sharply, with many raids dispersed before reaching their targets. In response, the Luftwaffe continually altered their communication protocols, but each change was quickly analyzed and countered. The race between German navigation techniques and British countermeasures became a critical aspect of the air war, a battle of intellects fought with oscilloscopes and frequency generators rather than guns and bombs. For security reasons, the full extent of Thornton's innovation remained highly classified. Official reports credited improved radar coverage and conventional night fighter operations for the reduced effectiveness of German raids. Thornton himself received the Distinguished Flying Cross in a private ceremony, the citation deliberately vague about his specific contributions. By the spring of 1941, the worst of the Blitz was over. Hitler's attention had turned eastward toward the Soviet Union, and while bombing of British cities continued intermittently, it never again reached the intensity of those dark days in 1940. Thornton's ghost beam technology evolved into increasingly sophisticated electronic warfare systems. By 1943, specialized aircraft in the RAF's 100th Group were dedicated entirely to electronic countermeasures, protecting bomber streams heading to Germany and disrupting enemy night fighters. What had begun as one pilot's unauthorized experiment had grown into an entirely new dimension of warfare. The principles pioneered with the ghost beam would influence military technology for decades to come, from the jammers and spoofers of the Cold War to the electronic warfare systems of the modern era. After the war, Merrill Thornton returned to civilian life, accepting a position with a telecommunications firm developing radio systems for commercial aviation. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, deflecting questions with modest references to doing my small part. In 1956, when electronic warfare techniques were finally declassified, several books mentioned the mysterious effectiveness of RAF night defense in the early Blitz period, but the full story of the ghost beam remained obscured in official histories. Thornton himself declined multiple interview requests, preferring to let others take credit for the advances in radar countermeasures. It wasn't until 1972, 3 years after his death from heart failure, that documents released under the 30-year rule revealed the true extent of his contribution. A small ceremony was held at the RAF Museum in Hendon, where his original notebook containing the first sketches of the ghost beam system was placed on display. The citation read simply, "Flight Lieutenant Merrill Thornton, whose ingenuity saved countless lives and changed the course of aerial warfare." Perhaps the most telling testament to his impact came from Luftwaffe records captured after the war. A report dated October 12, 1940, from the commander of a night bomber wing, contained this observation: "Something has changed in the British defences. Our pathfinders now report anomalous signals that seem to originate from nowhere and everywhere at once. They call it the ghost in the darkness. Until we understand this phenomenon, accurate target marking over London cannot be guaranteed." The ghost beam had done its work well. 21 German aircraft had vanished from their mission that night in September, not destroyed by guns or flames, but redirected by invisible signals crafted by one man's brilliant improvisation. Today, as electronic warfare specialists program sophisticated algorithms for aerial combat systems, few realize they are building upon principles first demonstrated by a night fighter crew over London in humanity's darkest hour. Their story reminds us that in warfare, innovation often comes not from grand strategies planned in command centers, but from the desperate ingenuity of those facing impossible odds on the front lines. In the skies above Britain during those pivotal days of 1940, one man's unauthorized experiment changed the rules of aerial combat forever. His ghost beam made enemy aircraft vanish not through destruction, but through deception, proving that in the battle between technologies, the most powerful weapon is often the human imagination. If you found yourself moved by this forgotten chapter of history, share this story so that others might remember what courage and innovation truly mean in our darkest hours. Would you have broken the rules to save thousands? The answer to that question reveals more about ourselves than we might care to admit.